Hello and welcome to Verso Live, a new virtual event program to celebrate 50 years of Verso books. All events are streamed live and will be available to watch again after the event has finished via our YouTube channel. Questions and comments can be made via the YouTube chat box. We hope you enjoy the event.
Good evening. Welcome to this event held by Verso Books. It's a strange word to use, but that's what's happening. I'm Aaron Bastani. I'm at home. This evening I'm joined by the one and only Grace Blakeley. I believe she's also at home. Hello, Grace.
I am. Hello.
We will be talking about, obviously, the coronavirus, or COVID-19 more specifically, and where our work fits in within that. What's working, what isn't, what do we think can or should change in the medium to long term, what might not change, and to what extent might that be detrimental to a progressive politics. I guess what we're going to do, just to explain to our audience watching this live, is I'll talk for 5-10 minutes, Grace will talk for 5-10 minutes, and then we'll be responding to some questions. And please, at any point, if you wish to ask a question, put those in the comments. Ralph will curate those. They'll come to us. We can then respond to them. So don't feel like there's a Q&A part after we stop talking. If something comes up and you want to ask a question, please feel free to do so. Hopefully, we'll respond to as many as possible. So, Grace, I guess I'll start, like I say, for 5-10 minutes. You can respond to perhaps some of it. You can say whatever you like. I mean, I guess you're going to have more to say off the cuff because obviously you've got this really important book coming out in the autumn about the corona crisis. The Guardian's always the Guardian's already hyping it up as one of the big books of this autumn.
I know, right? That was me thinking that we were going to be, pushed out of the Guardian sphere of influence, but apparently they still care.
It's all the more impressive because I think this autumn there's a huge number of books being published because, of course, people have just
because everyone's been stuck at home. We've all been writing books.
Yeah. So I guess I'll start things off within the context of Fully Automated Luxury Communism. Obviously, that was published more than a year ago now. The paperback is out. But what I think I got right in the book is I say automation is interesting, it's important, but the challenges it poses need to be folded within a much broader understanding of the crises we're going to face in the 21st century. And I call that the Great Disorder. And that relates to climate change, surplus populations, the end of US hegemony, the end of our economic model in terms of rising living standards for enough people to build domestic consent in OECD countries like Britain, Europe, the United States, a few other things too. Elderly care as well as a really big one. That'll be the focus of my next book with Verso. And what COVID-19 has done is it's gotten all of those challenges, which I think most of us presumed would take 20, 30 years to play out, and it's just dramatically accelerated them. And I think the most obvious example of this is with regards to US-China competition, the race for technological leadership between the United States and China. If China becomes the country to produce a COVID vaccine at scale, and it works, and by the way, they could do, that will be a really singular moment in the geopolitical and technological ascent of China. So that's one thing that's really come into sharp relief. Another is the collapse of our high streets. The idea of an economic model built around retail, built around low wage, low productivity service work, that's kind of been going for 20 years. Arguably, you could say 2008 is when it really gets serious. You get the collapse of Woolworths. More recently, we've seen Beals, Debenhams, M&S shops are closing, House of Fraser, Arcadia Group struggling. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to go down your local high street and you'll see loads of empties, which weren't there 10 years ago. And that's accelerating, that's intensifying. What COVID's also done is that's basically also transferred onto entry-level hospitality, Prezzo, Bella Italia. Again, these big businesses, which you could live in a relatively small town or a relatively big city, and it was identifiable on the high street. And what does that mean? It means they were paying their business rates, the local council. It means they were paying workers. And it means that there was a presence there on the high street in terms of the general social capital of the community. Now, that sounds like a vacuous term, social capital, the idea that there's actually some organic living society nearby. But empties mean, like I say, lower business rates, less money for the council. it means you lose jobs. But also empties on a high street has a kind of a multiplier effect. The more empties there are, the less likely new tenants want to go to that place, and it can lead to a rise in antisocial behaviour, etc., etc. So it's a huge challenge, the high street crisis, in terms of jobs, in terms of our broader economic model. And right now it's being neglected by both major parties. And then finally, I think what it's really done, and this has not been talked about nearly enough, and hopefully it's in Grace's book, is what it means for climate change. And I don't think we've talked about this nearly enough. It's the central topic of discussion in a new book coming out from Andreas Malm, The Corona Crisis and War Communism, out with Verso books. And Andreas Malm is very clear. We are now inserting the whole of global nature into circuits of capital. From the Amazon rainforest, the forests of Southeast Asia, these are being inserted into circuits of capital. What does that mean? It means they're being subject to the profit motive. They're being subordinated to the profit motive, which is immensely destructive. Now, why does that relate to coronavirus? Am I being just a reductive, silly leftist? Well, although COVID-19 obviously has been in many ways unprecedented, really, since the great flu pandemic of 1918, 1919, it's actually the third, what's called zoonotic coronavirus strain this century. So what does that mean? It's the third instance of a coronavirus crossing over from one species to another and affecting human beings. The previous two, what were they? SARS, many people have heard of that, 2002, 2003. That probably also came from bats. And then MERS, MERS, 2012, 2013. Now, both of those have a higher fatality rate than COVID-19, but COVID-19 has this incredible skill as a virus to find scale, because so many people are asymptomatic, or they don't exhibit symptoms before passing it on, and then they later show symptoms. So highly contagious, if less serious in terms of the fatality rate. It's certainly not like Ebola, which has a 50% fatality rate. Nonetheless, we're looking at, I think right now, more than 800,000 deaths, tens of millions of cases. But what it means in terms of the broader context of deforestation, climate change, is we're going to see more and more of these coronaviruses. Like I say, this is the third one. And why is that happening? Because you're seeing, I don't want to sound like a bat specialist. Bats have several thousand, we think, distinct strains of coronavirus. There's about 1,400 different species of bat. And, generally it's agreed that several hundred of these can probably hurt human beings. And so the more that we insert nature into these circuits of capital, the Andreas Malm hypothesis goes, the more likely we are to see zoonotic spillover. That is to say, viruses going from one mammal to another, from bats to us, or from pigs and cows to us, often from bats. That's how we think COVID-19 entered the kind of the food chain via a sort of intermediary livestock mammal. And this is going to become more and more of a problem. And we can go a bit further back. If you look at HIV/AIDS, it's taken tens of millions of lives. Again, it's agreed that basically HIV/AIDS possibly comes about as a result of bushmeat. In the mid-20th century in Africa, some part of Central Africa, people aren't really sure where, probably around the Democratic Republic of Congo, you have bushmeat, and a human being allows this virus to basically enter the human species. It crosses the species boundary. And then we obviously have the HIV/AIDS pandemic for a very long time. It's still ongoing. Other illnesses too. And I think this is really, really, really a central way of understanding what's going on now. And where the left is not at the races, and where I think it has to be, is to say there are going to be many, many more of these viruses. The more we do this, the more we destroy the Amazon rainforest, the more that we see deforestation in Southeast Asia. There's one estimate that says that 99% of the bat population of Southeast Asia will be displaced by deforestation by 2050. That means, the chances of more coronaviruses entering the human food chain go up almost exponentially. I don't use that word lightly. And there is a really strong literature around this. We know about Mike Davis, Andreas Malm, and so on, but there are other writers too. And so I think we need to look at COVID-19 in many ways as a premonition of the future. The return of biological, but non-human generated biological dangers to the human species. And I think we're going to see many, many more of them. And I think how that intersects with the general climate crisis, the crisis of our economic model, the aging crisis, that's not really relevant to today's conversation. I think, if anything, when I look back at what I wrote in Fully Automated Luxury Communism, that proposition that we're going to see between now and 2050, 2060, this period of a great disorder, really decoupling reality from expectations in terms of rising living standards, what we thought was the end of history. I think that's going to intensify and accelerate probably more than I imagined even 12 months ago. So, Grace, your thoughts? Well, I guess you might want to respond to that, or you probably just stated all these ideas far longer than I have, obviously, given you've written a book about them.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm going to talk about. Firstly, that was amazing, Aaron. Thank you so much for that that overview. I was listening to Andreas Malm on a podcast the other day talking about those ideas in his new book, and yeah, it looks really interesting and definitely worth listening to. One thing I do want to just say before I get started is, so obviously we just found out today that David Graeber has unfortunately died, and I mean, I just wanted to say that I want to, I suppose, like, dedicate what I'm going to say now to him. He's had such a huge impact on our movement. He's had a huge impact on me personally, and this is a really, really devastating loss, I think, for our movement. And I think, the situation that we find ourselves in now, where we're forced to rethink a whole load of concepts that we're taken for granted, like, how much public debt is adequate. How often should we be going into the office? What kind of work is good work? All of these questions were questions that he kind of occupied himself with for much of his career. And, I think we have a responsibility to consult his thinking on that and think quite hard about the kind of world that we rebuild in the wake of this tragedy, this pandemic. So yeah, I guess that's what I wanted to say at the outset. And with that in mind, I'm going to talk a little bit about, as I said, the kind of political economic implications of the pandemic, and talk about the Green New Deal as a potential answer to some of the challenges that we're going to be facing over the coming months and years.
Have we lost Grace? Let's get some questions in the comments, and that would be really welcome. This goes to show one of the great weaknesses right now of the British state is a complete absence of infrastructure building for the 21st century. Hopefully Grace will be back. She always goes down, her internet's rubbish. Yeah, well, that's what happens when you have a Tory government, sadly. What do I think about Posadism? Interesting. I mean, that shows what happens when the left completely detaches itself from material struggle, I suppose. In terms of who I was just talking about, their name was Andreas Malm. It's a great book coming out with Verso later this year, Coronavirus or Corona Crisis and More Communism. Don't be put off by the title. I mean, maybe you won't be. I certainly wasn't. But it's not necessarily what you expect. Isn't this just an accelerated evolution of humanity in digital society? I mean, there's a really important point to be made there, isn't there? The whole thing of a business wants us to go back to work. I don't think that's necessarily true. Actually, I think many businesses are perfectly happy to end the leases on their headquarters, save money, and effectively outsource to their staff the costs that were previously being given to landlords for an offline space. So the idea that big business wants us to go back to the office, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the rentier class wants us to go back to work. And that speaks to a fragmentation within the ruling class in this country. We saw it over Brexit too. There's a speculative class, there's a rentier class, and actually what they want, they tended to want Brexit. What they want is quite different from the kind of industrial capitalist class, although I have to say in this country that's been profoundly weakened in the last several decades since Thatcherism. Oh, it'd be such a shame if Grace doesn't come back. She was good for while I spoke, and then she went. Maybe we should get Ralph in too. Maybe Ralph and I can do this.
I'm not sure there's much I can add, but could you tell us a little bit about your upcoming book with Verso that you mentioned about social care?
Oh, my book in terms of elderly care?
Elderly care, yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be titled Mortals. Hopefully it's going to be out in 2021, 2022. And the kind of claim within the book is that elderly care, a coming crisis of elderly care, is in the short to medium term as bad as climate change. And its dimensions go beyond just simply the NHS will struggle. It's an existential challenge really to the welfare state as we know it in this country. But then there are some other dimensions beyond that which are really interesting. Geopolitical, for instance. China, we all know about the one-child policy. It's actually going to have a demographic complexion similar to Japan by 2050. It's going to be a very old country. And what that means with falling birth rates, longer life expectancy, is that before it becomes a rich country, it becomes an old country, which is not what happened to Europe and the United States as they industrialized. And that will really pose really significant challenges to it in terms of caring for its domestic population. At the same time, what you'll probably see, or what you will see, the question is to what extent, will be a contraction of the overall population. Right now, China's population, about 1.3 billion, about the same as India. India's population is expected to hit, I think, 1.5 billion, and then maybe it may begin to stagnate or contract. China, by the end of this century, could have a population of 600-700 million. Now, those are the worst case scenarios. And of course, a powerful authoritarian state which can impose a one-child policy can just as easily, I suppose, impose a three-child policy, right? Universal childcare, and really create lots of incentives for people to have more children. It can do that. But on present trends, I think the biggest challenge to China becoming a great power during the 21st century is demographics. And so it's a really sort of multifaceted question that really looks at culture, politics, economics, geopolitics. So hopefully spring 2022. But when I say that, it probably means like 2024 or something. We had a great question here actually from somebody saying, could we discuss the viral Dettol tube ad and what it understands about office solidarity? Quite a lot. I'd be interested to see what people think in the comments there, actually. What did you think about the Dettol ad? I mean, some people do enjoy their work environments. There's no denying it. And I wonder to what extent does that strike class? I think there are some working class environments which have been great fun. They just tended to pay terrible money.
Got a question here. Does the ruling class want greater control of the population by way of the pandemic?
The ruling class, well, the state always seeks greater control of populations. I mean, that's the general trend for several hundred years, isn't it? So, you can look at the creation of mass armies, general taxation, you get the creation of the census, the idea of identifying various features within the body politic. I mean, that's a centuries-old trend. It's constitutive of the modern state. The question, is that going to intensify? I think almost certainly. You will see this intersection of authoritarian capitalism and an interventionist state. The question is that going to be done from a progressive point of view or a non-progressive point of view? I think that's the challenge for the left in addressing this. This is a great question, actually, from Julie Setchfield. It's really important. What lessons can we learn from other countries, such as Vietnam, that have managed to handle a pandemic so well? So I think the number one question Number one sort of reason, rather, why Vietnam, for a long time, Vietnam didn't have a single death. And I say that to people, and they say, well, it's just obviously not true. They're concocting the numbers. There were Oxford academics corroborating that. People might have missed one or two, fatalities, but it, generally speaking, had an extraordinarily low fatality rate. It looked like it was in the single figures for a very long time, max. And there are a couple of reasons why that happened. The first is it's quite a young population. Firstly, right, if we think that the number one risk factor with this thing killing you is old age, then comparing an old society like Italy to a relatively young society like Iran or Vietnam, that's problematic. Secondly, in terms of why Vietnam did so well, it has this huge land border with China. Obviously, it was quarantining people, and it wasn't doing quarantine like we were doing our self-isolation. It was sending people to, state-sponsored places they would go and be monitored for a period of time. So I think a really effective quarantine strategy. And then finally, and probably most importantly, their track and trace system was very low tech, but it was basically about people knocking on doors, right? It was human-led, similar in Cuba, which again has done very well here. And it was interesting to see Andy Burnham earlier on today talk about that. Andy Burnham saying we need a solution around track and trace, which is, people knocking on doors, people collating data rather than necessarily relying on apps and feedback through mobile phones and so on. And I think that's a really, really, really good point. You could have a track and trace setup, very, low tech, but tens of thousands of people. I mean, why not? 100,000 people managing it across the country. Again, how long is it going to take before the government does something like that? We'll see.
I quite like this question about populist left thinking, because I started watching that show Rising with Crystal Ball and Saga Angetti.
Yeah, I love Crystal Ball. Yeah,
she's great. Just like that, great. It's that confidence they have on Fox News, but she's not saying horrible, bigoted things. Yeah.
So the question about left populism.
What are your thoughts on populist left thinking, and can they work with the so-called populist right? Because I feel like those two. This is from Ak Da Scholar. I guess what's always interesting about the Crystal and Saga is that they tend to find unusual common ground. I thought that a bit, actually. Speaking of Grace, she did a really good YouTube interview with Douglas Carswell, and they agreed on way more than I thought they would agree on.
Yeah, but Douglas Carswell's full of crap, right? No, he is, because he'll say, he's somebody who has like an intellectually thought out position as a libertarian conservative, which, like you say, on paper you go, I agree with lots of that. But when he was a Conservative MP, he wasn't, that wasn't his voting record. The political party he was a member of, that wasn't what they were doing. And it's the libertarian that says, oh, well, you claim to be an anarchist or a libertarian socialist, and yet you support the NHS. I'm actually more intellectually coherent than you are. That's not the libertarian socialist position. You believe in libertarian principles for individuals, but you don't want to destroy like concentrations of class power which ensure universal healthcare. That's absolutely not what we should be doing. But I think one thing, and I think it'd be interesting to see people respond to this in the comments, is I think a lot of people have been very hard on themselves because we say, oh well, look, the left got so much right over the last couple of decades, called the Iraq War being a complete catastrophe, called the global financial crisis, called the hollowing out of basically third way social democracy, made lots of really good calls. And then said, well, but you called the last election wrong. It was always improbable that Labour would go, even when Labour were polling ahead of the Tories, it was always improbable they were going to form a majority for a bunch of reasons. But the principal reason that the left has lost in Britain and the United States is a very simple one. It's resources, right? It's money. It's access to institutional power. You could see, for instance, the campaign for a second referendum. They wanted to do something. That's great. You're a civil society actor. You want to do something great, but they could throw 5-10 million at it. There aren't people in public life who say, you know what, we want a £15 minimum wage. Let's throw £15 million at that campaign to get a £15 minimum wage. If somebody were to do that, I would submit that would be a very successful campaign. We'd probably get an increase in the minimum wage. And so the idea that the left fails because its people aren't good enough, or its ideas are no good, or because the people operating left aren't as talented as on the right, or whatever, I simply don't buy that. It's about an asymmetry of power. It's about access to resources. And so that ties back into the populist question. Oh, well, the left populist thing didn't win with Sanders and with Corbyn. I don't think Corbyn was the left populist as it goes. I simply don't buy that. I think in a democratic society, you need popular policies. You need people to vote for them. And I think, one of the sort of foundational pillars of third way social democratic politics, kind of Blair, Lionel Jospin, Bill Clinton, was to say, actually, we can do incredibly unpopular policies, and our base, our sociological base, whether it was the Rust Belt states in the US, which, by the way, now vote Trump, or whether it was the Red Wall in Britain, which, by the way, now vote for the Tories, they're always going to vote for us anyway. And so I think, actually, no, but it's never been more critical that a successful left politics, it would necessarily, it has to look at, a populist agenda. It can't say we don't want to be popular. I think that's silly. And actually, a great thinker on this is Jacques Rancière, Hatred of Democracy. And he makes a very compelling case to say that actually those who are critical of populism fundamentally hate democracy. They hate the democratic impulse, and they're using really populism as a tax on populism as a sort of substitute for that. Yeah. I still find it shocking. I feel sorry for you, Ralph. Maybe we should do the Ralph and Aaron show. We haven't got Grace here. It's kind of sad.
It's been a while. I don't know where Grace has gone. I'll send her another email. We got some thoughts here, more thoughts here about rising.
Can I answer this question from Rebecca Parkinson?
Of course.
Yeah. So. Entry-level reading for someone learning more and more left-leaning, sorry, Rebecca. I need my glasses. Leaning more and more left-wing with the ongoing ineptitude of consecutive conservative governments.
With an emphasis on Verso published books, if you could.
Yeah, well, what else? I mean, you can't see it here, but actually I've got one of my bookcases here, and it's all Verso books. Really, knowledge isn't power, but it's pretty close. And I think history is a really powerful thing. I think you really understand the debates we're going through right now. I would say to you, Becca, a great book, if you're interested in the media, and this isn't a Verso book, sorry, Ralph, we'll do those. There's a great book called Stick It Up Your Punter, right? Punter obviously being a consumer of news in the media industry. And it's a history of the Sun newspaper from 1968-69 when Rupert Murdoch bought it, all the way through to the early mid-1990s. And what's really striking is that you're saying you're going more and more left because of the ineptitude of Tory governments. A lot of the debates we're having now, cultural wars, this has all happened before. This was all happening in the 80s. The free speech scares, the political correctness stuff, the IRA stuff, it was all being used 30, 40 years ago. So I think the first thing is history. It really helps you contextualize what's going on. Stick Up Your Punter. It's a very good book. And then in terms of Verso books, I think a great book I always recommend people is Immanuel Wallerstein. I think it's called World Historical Systems. And that is a very short book, about 120 pages. If you put Verso, Immanuel Wallerstein, you'll see the front cover is I think it's a lot of little fishes. That was the old cover anyway, and a big fish, talking about sort of a metaphor for collective action. So that would be my number one for Marxism. Let me see what have I got here. The best Verso books. There are so many. I think if I had to say one, I'd say two. Actually, I'll say three. I'll say four. Aaron Kanani, The Muslims Are Coming. Very, very good book. Again, a very good work of history. Number two, History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. By Raj Patel and Jason Moore. Very, 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 very good book. Number three would be Andreas Malm, Corona Crisis and War Communism. Again, a really short book, maybe 120 pages. When that comes out, you should definitely buy it. And then number four, where did I see it a second ago? The Long 20th Century, Giovanni Arrighi. Again, a really great historical overview of what's going on. But I suppose, what you could do is just read The Economist. Read the Financial Times. I think if you read the Financial Times every day for a week, you'll just be shocked at how much crazy stuff is going on. these huge companies that are building, we all see this, student accommodation. There's this glut of student accommodation. Every single things are being knocked down left, right, and center. We have a housing crisis, and yet developers are still building acres and acres of student accommodation. And the reason why is you have these huge global funds saying, well, our rate of return per year from student accommodation for the last 15 years is 4, 5, 6%. That's what it's going to be going forward. And it's a completely abstracted engagement, with space, right? This is about, we should really be saying we need places for people to have jobs, to produce things they want, to enjoy leisure activities, to live. But when you read about property as commodity, when you read about social life as commodity through the prism of the economist with Financial Times, very interesting. Here we go. Yeah, Wallerstein, Historical Capitalism, very good book. It's interesting. Go on, Ralph.
Oh, I was just wondering if now might be a nice moment to reflect a little on David Graeber's legacy. And you introduced David to me like many years ago, and he's very firm. I remember we did the Cops on Campus demonstration, and he was really supportive of that. And just looking through Twitter today, he's had such a huge impact on a lot of people's lives. So,
yeah, David was a really unique man. He was an outstanding historic intellectual. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think Debt is one of the First 5,000 Years, published in 2011, I think is arguably the most important intervention by a left academic in English in the post-2008 world. I would really hold him up as one of a handful of people who've shaped the Anglophone left in the last 20, 30 years. I'd say probably him and David Harvey are the top two. Then you get other people. You could say Mark Fisher, Capitalist Realism, as an intervention, as a single book, and I think that's probably fair. But David's work, whether it was Debt, whether it was his early stuff on anarchist anthropology, whether it was Bullshit Jobs, this guy was repeatedly taking on things and casting them in a whole new light. And he was doing it on a very regular basis. It wasn't just a one-off, a hugely important intellect. And I think, the post-2008 left in Britain and the United States would look very, very different without David Graeber. And it's obviously always sad when somebody passes. It's a tragedy because obviously he won't do more of that. But I was thinking about this earlier, even though he died as a young man, he has a tremendous legacy, tremendous. His output, his influence, it was inestimable. I think many people, many writers would be hugely, immensely happy to have achieved what he did over their entire lives. He did it over 30 years of academic intellectual activity, but not just that. So that's the person who's written the books, who's helped shape that debate. But there was also a person, there was a human being, and he was incredibly humble. The first time I met David Graeber, I think was in late 2010, and we were having a conversation. I was in London, and there was a group of people, and we were having a conversation that it turns to the political role of debt. And David Harvey isn't dead. No, it's David Graeber, sadly. Both, as I say, leading sort of voices on the Anglophone left in the last, I think, 15 years. But when I met David, he said, I'm writing a book about that. I'm writing a book about debt. And this was, of course, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And so an incredibly humble man, incredibly talented man. He would always stand up for grassroots activism. He had no ego. He had no ego whatsoever. And you could talk to him like you could talk to absolutely anybody. I mean, as you kind of touched upon there, Ralph. And it's an immense loss. It's an immense loss to the left. It's an immense loss to his friends and colleagues and his family, because he was a wonderful man. But like I say, there's an incredible legacy there. I mean, it's really remarkable. 3-4 interventions, which are huge. He already had a career before. People don't realize this. He already had a really successful career before Debt, the First 5,000 Years. He was already one of the best anthropologists of his generation before 2011. He was at Yale. He didn't get tenured there because the argument goes there was a political battle there because he was going to bat for his students engaged in activism, engaged in unionization activities. And so he didn't get a contract, which had he got that contract at Yale, he then would have got tenure. And then, he still, in spite of that, when I spoke to him about it, there was never any bitterness, never any rancor. He came to Britain, went to Goldsmiths, did debt the first 5,000 years. That's when, he went stratospheric. Then he, of course, got the job at the LSE. I think, we'll have to wait a long time before we get as an accomplished intellectual academic at his age. Did I so young? It's sad beyond words, really.
Absolutely. We've got Grace back in. Welcome back, Grace.
When did I cut out, by the way? Because I was just sat there talking at my screen because my notes were in front of me, and then I came back onto Chrome and it had just gone. How much did you hear of me?
Very little, Grace. Presume we heard nothing. Hey, look, no,
I was just talking to myself for 25 minutes.
Oh, wow. That's kind of instructive, isn't it? Did you not think I'd try and better? You're only meant to talk for 5 minutes.
Whatever. Oh God, that was.
Anyway,
bad.
I'll go. Get rid of me, Ralph. Let's hear what Grace has to say.
Right. Okay. I guess I'll start from the beginning again. This is an absolute nightmare and just indicates quite how terrible internet is in large parts of this country. So yeah, I don't know where exactly I got to. But what I was basically talking about was the kind of political economic implications of the pandemic. And what I've written about a bit in the Corona Crash and what I want to talk a bit about today is this idea that the pandemic is kind of showing us the beginnings of potentially a new model of capitalism, perhaps a post-neoliberal form of capitalism, which is one based on an increasingly interventionist states and a kind of monopolization, a centralization of the economy. And these are trends that kind of go back many decades now, and you can trace the beginnings of them to the kind of early era of neoliberalism. But what the pandemic's really done is it's revealed the class nature of state intervention. Because the character of the interventions that we've seen, the ordering of the interventions we've seen, which has put the interests of capital and particular sections of capital, so international financial capital in particular, above others, above the interests of workers, above the interests of most other people in society, just indicates in whose interests state intervention is undertaken. And of course, the left, particularly in the UK, has developed over the last 10 years with this critique of austerity, which has been, the state isn't doing enough. If we could just get the state to do a bit more, if we get it to do a bit more investment, if we could, get it to tax the rich a bit more, whatever, then, and by the way, tax is not austerity, in case anyone's been following that debate. High taxes for the rich are not austerity. But obviously, in the context of a government now, which is saying, we might, increase taxes on wealth, and one which has obviously dramatically expanded the level of state intervention in the economy over the course of the pandemic, those lines kind of ring a little bit hollow. But it's also clear that, as I said, state intervention is not neutral. State intervention is undertaken in the interests of capital. And actually, that's kind of a question that we really avoided, I think, analysing a lot and talking about a lot, because, this issue of austerity was so clear, and it was, the right line to take at the time, because it had a kind of populist register. But today, we are now kind of exposed as having failed to analyse the nature of the capitalist state, because we're kind of, and you can see, I think, a lot of people on the left, not just politicians, but, a lot of different people struggling to make sense of what is going on right now. I think we're all struggling to make sense of what's going on right now, but struggling to kind of put together a narrative that will allow us to respond in a coherent way to what Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak are doing. And, often I think there is this tendency to say, okay, right, the Tories have basically taken on all the arguments that we've been making for the last 10 years. The Tories are basically socialists economically now, and we can just stick to opposing their kind of xenophobic, reactionary stances on, migration, on Black Lives Matter, on various other social issues, and basically get pushed into this culture war battle, which the left always ends up losing. And I think that's a kind of wrong way to look at it, because actually we're not seeing the kind of emergence of a socialist state that has accepted all the arguments of Jeremy Corbyn. What we're seeing is a state that is intervening in the interests of capital during a crisis moment. And in fact, throughout the last 40 years, because neoliberalism has been a system that's been riven by crises. We've consistently seen states all over the world stepping in to promote the interests of capital. And in fact, when you look at many emerging market economies, you see this model not only having emerged, but actually really having consolidated itself, which is one where, you know, often these states are highly authoritarian, but they have significant levels of intervention. They often have significant levels of state ownership over the economy. This isn't just China. This is many of these other economies. And it increasingly looks like a model that many states around the world are adopting, which is effectively, you know, capitalism has lost a huge amount of momentum. Productivity has stagnated. Investment in fixed capital has been woeful in recent years. The only thing they've really been able to do is keep monetary policy extremely loose, so keep interest rates very low and just pump money into the financial system in an attempt to get the private sector to invest more. But of course, they haven't invested in things that are useful. They've just taken that money and they've used it to buy up, you know, property, shares in Apple, commodities, whatever. They've used it to kind of entrench their rentier power. And so we've ended up in this situation where you have a kind of roaring financial sector, roaring asset markets, and a stagnant and really kind of broken real economy. And that kind of disparity is really largely explained by two things. Firstly, levels of state intervention, and secondly, monopoly power, because those shares that are doing particularly well at the moment, those companies that are doing particularly well at the moment, are ones that have a huge amount of monopoly power, and they've been able to gain that, at least in part, because of their relationship to the state and because of state policies like, you know, very loose competition law, like low interest rates that allow them to buy up other corporations, like, you know, states' refusal to tax these entities properly, like their refusal to regulate the way they treat their workers. So what we are increasingly seeing, as I said, is the kind of the emergence of a model that looks quite different to neoliberalism. It's one where the ideology, because obviously neoliberalism was never really about the total reduction of state intervention. It was never about the exit of the state from economic intervention. It was about the use of the state to promote a particular set of class interests. But the ideology around that was that there's states, there's markets, there's politics, there's economics, and never the twain shall meet, effectively. What we're increasingly seeing today is the politicization of the economy. And it's very difficult for the economy not to be politicized, given the sheer number of huge interventions that states all over the world have had to undertake over the past decade or more just to keep the system going. It is increasingly obvious that markets are not self-correcting, that if you just leave capitalism, if you just leave markets, if you just leave the system to regulate itself, then you're going to end up with these huge crises that threaten to bring down the entire economy, that threaten to create crises of living standards that threaten to create political turmoil, whilst also this looming threat of climate breakdown constantly being on the horizon. So if neoliberalism was the kind of answer to the problems that had begun to emerge in the 1970s, problems around, you know, falling profitability, around the growing power of the working class in the global north, around kind of the increasing disparity between the technologies that were being created and their use in capital accumulation, and the restrictions that existed on the ability of kind of money, goods, and people to move around the world, then the model that we're beginning to see emerge now is an answer obviously developed by the powerful to the problems that we're facing today, which are stagnant productivity, low rates of investment, the construction of an economic model based on this growing disparity between asset markets and the real economy, where if you have wealth, then you are increasingly protected by a state which sees it as its role to protect asset prices, and everyone else who's effectively kind of left out in, you know, with very few protections, with a state that is retreating from the provision of many basic public services. And you combine that with some of the other trends that we've seen in recent years. So as I said, that trend towards monopolization, what Marx calls the centralization of capitalism, the growth of monopoly power, and financialization, where you're seeing, again, massive concentration in the banking sector and the increasing power today of huge asset managers who manage the assets of the wealthy. Then, you know, you start to develop the beginnings of both an analysis and a critique because I think it's quite clear that we do need to move on from this idea that the only problem with, you know, the British state at the moment is that it's not spending enough money. And actually, you begin to get to a critique, which is basically that there is a tiny number of people at the very top of our economy, a kind of cabal of politicians, central bankers, investors, financiers, chief executives, who are working together in this kind of cartel-like model to basically plan economic activity, to construct markets, to construct capitalism in their own interests, and in doing so, threatening the interests of not just working people, but also the entire planet. And I think that begins to get us closer to what a populist message for this particular moment has to look like, which is not, you know, give more power to politicians so they can make the state do better things. That message was never going to be compelling, and, you know, it was never going to work. The message has to be power is so concentrated in our society, and in many ways the concentration of wealth is a reflection of that concentration of power. The only way to push back against that is to decentralize and redistribute power, is to take power away from those people at the very top and hand it down to ordinary people in all the most important institutions that govern our lives. So whether that's the state, whether that's, you know, firms, whether that's the banking system, whatever. We need this message that basically we need to democratize the economy. And in fact, that has been a thread that has run through particularly the Labour left for a very, very long time. I've just finished reviewing Colin Lee's and Leo Panich's book, Searching for Socialism, for Catalyst. And that is a really strong theme there, is that, you know, it's always been a really central demand of those on the left that it was not enough for just the state to own large swathes of the economy, that there had to be a push towards democratization. So I think this message of democratization has to be the kind of central you know, the thing that differentiates a left Green New Deal from, say, a liberal Green New Deal. And of course, you know, the only real way out of this crisis, regardless of what your political views are, the only way out of this crisis without bringing down upon our heads many more crises like this over the coming years, as Aaron was talking about at the beginning so eloquently, is to have some sort of Green New Deal. Now, obviously, we're going to end up getting various stimulus packages of different kinds, because that's what capitalist states do to save capitalism during moments of crises. Some of them may well be green stimulus packages. That's just very sensible, even from a basic kind of Keynesian perspective, because green stimulus packages create more jobs than brown stimulus packages. The question we really have to be asking is, in whose interests are these you know, proposals being made, and who is in control of them? Because I think, you know, the real impetus behind the populist backlash that we've seen in recent years, the real kind of, you know, the real challenge that we face is people feeling disempowered. You know, the reason that the left often does so badly electorally is not because the Tories take all our voters. It's just because most voters on the left, most working class voters, don't vote. And this is actually a trend that's only happened over the last several decades, really since the late 1990s, is that working class voters have just dropped out of the electorate. And when you ask them, they say they're all the same, no matter what happens, no matter who I vote for, nothing's going to change in my life. There's just a pervasive sense of disempowerment and alienation. And I think this message of democratization and of taking back control, as it were, from the people who have monopolized power and wealth at the very top of our society as part of a program to completely transform the nature of our economy, in, you know, pursuit of decarbonization, to tackle what is the biggest challenge that humanity faces. And in fact, you know, everyone really knows that. There's huge support across the board for a Green New Deal and for measures to tackle climate breakdown. So I think combining those two things, alongside all our kind of, you know, usual talking points about public ownership, about, you know, workers' rights, etc., is what can differentiate a kind of left Green New Deal today from those that liberals and Keynesians will undoubtedly be putting forward in the coming months and years. I have a lot more to talk about how this would work at a global level, but I'm running out of time, so I think we can maybe open up to questions and then come back to some of those points later. I can't hear you, Aaron. There you go.
Well, you can hear me now. I muted myself. Can I ask you a question? So you talk about the Colin Lee's Leo Panich book, which is brilliant. It's such a great, again, we were talking about histories, and when you were briefly off air, I was asked for book suggestions, and I said, histories can be incredibly useful. But I wonder that the question about democratization, and I think it was actually the great weakness of the Corbyn project, was that often it just became this panacea. And so people would say to Jeremy Corbyn or John McDonnell, do you want to do this? And rather than say, I'm the elected leader, or we're the political faction now in charge of a party that seeks to govern Britain, we want to do this. Rather than do that, I say, well, that's what the members want. And I wonder, and often that just, it was kind of like a get out of jail card. But the sad thing is, and look, you can do that. The sad thing is, it was never followed through to something like mandatory selection, or even just primaries like they have in the US, right? We're seeing this week after week in the US right now. Candidates are being primaried, and so I wonder that idea of democratization. I think on the one hand, it was a response to certain problems in the 60s. That new left comes out of responding to Harold Wilson and so on. But I don't think it necessarily has all the answers, because we had a trial run of people who came out of that new left, and actually they hadn't sought to address a bunch of strategic questions, because democracy, party democracy, members-led democracy were these kind of abstract panaceas, which meant they didn't have to do some really tough thinking. I'm interested to see what you know. Interested to know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a point there, which is not one that I'd really talked about, which is, again, the question of democratization within the Labour Party. I mean, so what I've been talking about primarily here is democratization as a kind of political economic strategy. So as a party that was, as a governing party, what are some of the policies that you could campaign on and ultimately implement in order to, I suppose, attempt to shift the relative power of capital and labour in the context of a state that is much more interventionist? And my answer to that would be, democratise and socialise the ownership of big corporations. I think, We Own It had some really interesting ideas as to how publicly owned companies could be governed from the bottom up. You have, you can also have big changes to corporate governance in the rest of the private sector. You have a strengthening of the union movement, and a democratization of the union movement itself. You have a transformation in the way we run public services, a decentralization of the state, removal of the kind of completion of the UK's bourgeois revolution, a removal of those kind of more arcane elements of the British state, like the House of Lords, for example. You can have a democratization of the Bank of England, and there's been some good thinking by, for example, Positive Money as to how you would democratize some of those committees that make decisions on, for example, monetary policy. So there's a whole load of institutions, and this is again part of the neoliberal shift, is the move towards technocracy, so that power was taken away actively from democratically accountable institutions and put into the hands of technocrats, and that's something that can be and should be reversed. But then there is obviously this question of how we get there, and the whole kind of new left thing was democratize the Labour Party, democratize the state, then democratize the economy, and democratizing the Labour Party was always the most difficult part of that, because, and this is a problem with this narrative around democratization more generally, is that you can only do this when you are in a position of power, and when you are in a position of power, there are huge disincentives to do things like decentralization, to basically change the structures of the system that have allowed you to get to the place that you are. And that's the case with the Labour Party just as much as it is with the British state. But I think actually, and this is an interesting tactical and strategic question that I haven't thought enough about, so I'm just kind of thinking on my feet here. But we've obviously, since the election, there's been this whole the left moved too far towards electoral politics. We need to start thinking about movement building outside of the institutions of the Labour Party, etc., etc. And that kind of can descend into caricature on occasion. But I also do think that is quite important, because it is going to be difficult for us to organise within the Labour Party. It's going to be difficult for us to make our voices heard on anything. And yet we have so much to say about what is going on at this moment, about the particular, problems and challenges that we face, about the kind of contradictions of the system that we're living in. So how do we make our voices heard, and how do we build power while having, the knowledge that the Labour Party is not, in inverted commas, ours anymore, to the extent that it ever actually was. And yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I don't have the answers to that question, but I do think it requires us to be creative and to try and build power outside of institutions that we might be used to operating in. I don't think we've got that down now, because one, you know, key element of that, I think, would be coordination across various different groups that and institutions that we do have. So much more coordination between, you know, the labour movement, groups like Momentum, various, you know, the kind of social movements that are animating so much of our public discussion today, and something like the SCG. But we're in this phase right now where basically I think people are just kind of depressed and demotivated and don't really want to think about organising. We kind of tend to like go back into our own little bubbles rather than think about moving outwards, and that's understandable. But I mean, yeah, that is really the next phase is just building power, I guess, and that is a much bigger and deeper and longer and more difficult question to answer than what could we do and what should we be saying in this economic context.
How do you think it plays out if there is if there's a minority Labour government, let's say, and I don't think that's likely. I do think Labour is, you know, has huge. It's not. I'm not diminishing Kier Starmer's leadership or anything like that. I just think with the issue of Scotland, I think the possibility of, you know, Wales being the next red wall, I think I feel in many ways sorry for him, because you've had this 30 year trend briefly suspended under Corbyn in 2017, and basically Kier Starmer's just picking that up again. But if there was to be a sort of Labour minority government, do you see any possibility of a Kier Starmer-led government being able to address the big crises of Britain's economy, of its public services? You've talked about, for instance, lack of productivity and so on. How do you see that potentially playing out? Do you think it would be a sort of do you think you would necessarily need the left to do something with a broader base, or do you think you would necessarily have to capitulate to a kind of centrist orthodoxy, which, as we know, isn't really solving problems right now? I'd be interested to know your thoughts.
I think a minority Labour government obviously is a challenge, is more of a challenge. But I think there are things that Kier Starmer could do easily while in power that would be broadly, I mean, actually quite narrowly social democratic in character, that would be acceptable to his coalition, and that would basically balance doing what this government is doing, which is attempting to meet the needs of capital with some more giveaways for working people. So, you know, I do think that this government at some point is likely to do some sort of post-crisis stimulus program. The question as to how big that will be is another one. You know, Boris Johnson will be promising investment in the Red Wall, etc., etc. Kier Starmer could basically do a version of that, which is a kind of, you know, Keynesian cleanup operation that does more green stuff and maybe, you know, is combined with changes to the welfare system and a little bit more investment in public services. And then probably some big giveaways to the right on these kind of social and cultural issues that he thinks he needs to do to win back those voters that we lost over Brexit. But I think in many ways that just really demonstrates to the left what the challenge really is, because you are just going to see, I think, much more, well, I mean, a kind of normal historical level, but much more relative to the last 5 years, alignment between, you know, left of centre and right of centre parties that are now in power on what needs to be done to save the system. There are very few economists, even of the kind of neoclassical variety, who are going around now saying impose austerity. Fewer than there were in the wake of the financial crisis, and I think that's going to provide a kind of level of alignment between those two parties. So that's obviously something that Kier Starmer could do quite easily. The question then is what is that going to do to the economy over the long run? Is it going to solve all these structural problems that we face? Is it going to be enough to deal with climate breakdown? Is it going to be enough to deal with what we haven't really talked about yet, which is the just unbelievable challenges that exist at the global level in terms of, you know, dealing with this massive debt crisis that the global south is facing, rearranging, reprogramming all our international institutions that are failing so badly, not just to deal with this crisis, but actually to allocate resources effectively to tackle climate breakdown. Will it, solve even the problem of inequality within the UK? Because, stimulus programs don't do that. They're not really designed to deal with those kind of structural issues about who gets what. They're just designed to kind of get the economy going again. Will he be able to, basically take on the political and economic interests that wish to see the system remain as it is? And I don't think that he will. So I think, yes, he will be able to probably clean up some of this mess, but he won't be able to solve any of those underlying deeper contradictions. And he won't be able to, at the same time, answer many people's concerns and, basically anger about the state of our society today. And for that reason, actually, why would you vote for pound shop Boris Johnson, who has slightly better but basically the same economic policies as you do, but who's like less hard on immigrants by like half a millimeter? It just doesn't seem like there's any real reason for many of those voters who went for Boris Johnson at the last election to switch to Kier Starmer at the next election, if he's not promising anything radical on the economy, and on all other areas of policy, he's basically just doing what the Conservatives are promising, but like a little bit less bad and very forensically and with lots of competence. Most people don't care about competence. Most people don't watch PMQs. Most people have nothing but disdain for most of our political institutions. So they're not going to care about, Boris Johnson's attitude towards the judiciary or whatever. So, I'm not particularly optimistic about his chances of the next election. Obviously, it all depends on the economy, as we're seeing in the US. But basically, no is the answer to your question. I don't think he has any of those answers.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. In 95, I saw a great chart today. 1995, Tony Blair, in terms of personal approval, was like 25 ahead of John Major. But actually, he was basically where Kier Starmer and Boris Johnson are today, in terms of about 40% of the public seem to like them. And the point is that, Boris Johnson isn't collapsing like John Major did. And I suspect that's because basically the media is never going to attack Boris Johnson like it did John Major. We could talk about a bunch of reasons why, the complexion of the media in this country has just changed so dramatically. But I guess here's another question. You implicitly there, you've said you think the centre right and the centre left will kind of converge around a solution to, well, not solution, there isn't a solution really, but a consensus, a compromise in a post-COVID-19 world. What we're seeing in the United States is obviously the complete opposite of that. The political class, elements of the political class wants to do that, but actually you're seeing further polarization. And yes, to some extent that's being driven by the radical left, and more so Donald Trump, who ultimately is just one politician. But he does reflect a sizable chunk of American public opinion, whatever the sort of centrist intelligentsia would like to think. And so what COVID-19 there is doing is driving polarization, whereas you think the opposite may happen here. I would love to hear you maybe just detail that out a bit more. Do you think we'll have, because we've just come out of 5 years of real polarization. The culmination is a hard Brexit and an 80 seat majority for the Tories. I think partly because the centre couldn't get behind the left. We can discuss that another time. But do you now think that will lead us to a period of greater polarization or less in Britain?
Yeah, I don't think that polarization will. Yeah, I don't think that we will get less polarization on a load of different things. I just think that the centre left and the centre right will increasingly be in accord about a political economic response to this crisis, which will basically be a kind of rebirth of Keynesianism. I think that will actually create more division in the rest of society, because people will look on at that and think, my life isn't getting any better. Sure, we've just about survived this crisis, but now my wages are lower, I have more debts, my living standards are worse, and we've got this looming threat of climate breakdown. Politicians have basically just reconverged around the centre. It's become just like it was, in the 1990s, where you could basically vote for two different people who are basically promising the same thing. And in that context, the right wins out, because the right is able to say, what differentiates us? We'll give you everything you want economically. What differentiates us is that we listen to the masses. We understand that actually the real issues in your life are the migrants that are crossing over the channel right now. We understand that the real issue in your life is statues being torn down by thugs or whatever. And that is a message that isn't compelling to the majority of society, but it's a message that is able to unite a big enough portion of the electorate often to win elections. I mean, that's obviously the big difference with perhaps Johnson today and Major back then, is that Johnson has had this ability to unite the kind of respectable centre-right with much more extreme xenophobic nationalistic elements who are attracted by his kind of cultural message. And obviously we're going to see that, you know, I mean, we're basically going to see if the centre, in inverted commas, liberals coalesce around these responses to the crisis that we're facing right now, those longer term crises, those structural contradictions are going to generate two sets of opposing answers elsewhere, as we've seen, you know, already, which is on the right, you have nationalism, xenophobia, put the borders up, keep the migrants out, climate breakdowns happening, but the rest of the world can be underwater. We'll just stay here in our little fortress, England. And on the left, but the left's voice won't be there because, you know, I mean, well, it will be there less because the far right basically has control over many of these centre-right political parties. We'll be saying, hopefully, let's democratize our society. Let's do a kind of expansive Green New Deal that allows us to deal with many of these problems. Let's, you know, tackle inequality. Let's find a sustainable solution to the problems that have been generated by globalization, change, you know, the structure of the international system, all these different sorts of things. But, you know, that voice is perhaps drowned out by the voices within liberal centre-left parties who are basically like, let's just broadly keep everything the same, don't rock the boat, we'll do a little bit of Keynesianism and we'll do a little bit of pandering to the right and hope that our competence allows us to win the day. So I don't think there will be less division by any stretch of the imagination. You know, we are living through you know, it's often used, but an organic crisis, right, of capitalism, where the kind of political economic conditions are shifting so much that the institutions that have been built on the basis of a previous setup are struggling and straining to adapt to this new terrain. It's like there's this earthquake going on and all the buildings are kind of like, oh, where are we going next? So, you know, we're going to be living in a world of division, of, you know, mounting, what feels like mounting chaos, I think, for a very long time now. And either we will solve those problems, either we will come together to rationally plan our economy and our society in a way that allows us to tackle those issues, or things will get more chaotic. So yeah, that's perhaps quite bleak. But I also think, you know, we do have the capacity, and we are learning as a movement how to make our voices heard more effectively, and how to actually build power, not just in political parties, actually, yes, in political parties, that is important, but also in various other institutions. And that's kind of my hope, I suppose, for the coming years, is that the left is able to translate, you know, the growing pressure from below that has manifested itself as all these various different social movements into a level of institutional power that allows us to provide a narrative as to what is going on in this crisis, and hopefully eventually get to a point where we can think about state power as well.
I've got one final question. We've gone a bit longer than we initially said, because of course there was that brief interlude with just me. No, not at all. It's the Tories' fault. Yeah,
it is.
It's an infrastructural issue. I guess, you know, you've said that Boris Johnson has united the right. He clearly successfully united the right in late 2019, and that's the basis of that big majority they've got. You know, they've managed to unite the right to an extent which hasn't really happened since 1992. But I wonder, you know, that in itself internalizes lots of contradictions. So if there is a big, you know, and there will have to be, I agree, to an extent, there will have to be some kind of consensus around increasing taxes. I mean, they're going to have to increase taxes. I mean, they may not be dramatic, but they clearly can't have tax cuts, for instance. And there's a big part of the Tory parliamentary party, more so the membership, actually. The membership is more, you know, crazed about this stuff, who think that tax cuts the answer to everything, who think that industrial policy is always bad, who think that public ownership is always bad. Now, on the one hand, I agree with you that we're all socialists in a crisis, and I think the Tories do that. And that doesn't mean that doesn't preclude the possibility of them adopting these strategies. But I do think, you know, a bunch of people a wing of the party which has really been in the ascendant for the last since 2016. The right of the party, the Eurosceptic, sort of anarcho-capitalist wing, which a lot of them are that fundamentally. They don't have any welfare state whatsoever. I mean, they're not going to be happy with that. And so I wonder, do you think there's going to be a fragmentation there? And if not, why not? And I think there probably won't be, because they're much more serious about power in many ways than the centre-left is. And I think the great analogy there is Margaret Thatcher, when she won the Tory leadership in 1975, was it? In the mid-70s, a single member of the shadow cabinet backed her to be the Tory leader. A single member. It's Keith Joseph. But once she won, they got behind her. You know, you could not, and they understood. Like, she had an analysis. She was like, Keynesianism doesn't work anymore. We need monetarism. Inflation's too high. We need to increase unemployment. We need to privatize loads of stuff. And that was not the common sense position in the Tory party, right? And she managed to change the direction of travel for the Conservatives in a historic way. But the Tory party got behind her. So I think the question is that replicable on the Labour Party, or do you think it's implausible on the Labour Party? And I suppose that connects to the other question of, do you think we should expect or foresee some kind of fragmenting in this incredibly robust, so far, it has to be said, around coronavirus coalition on the right?
I think, I mean, there are obviously people within the Tory party, obviously, who are still very committed to that neoliberal / neoclassical way of understanding the economy. I think the issue for them is that they will struggle to find a base now. And I think the Tories aren't just more serious about power. They're much better able, because they're much more nimble, they're smaller, at feeling out the shifting sands of capitalism's material base, and then throwing up figures who are able to represent different interest groups. And in many ways, you can see, Thatcher versus, say, Heath as like the victory of the representative of financial over industrial capital. I think that the issue that you're gonna have today is that those anarcho-capitalists, as you might call them, will struggle to find a base, because which capitalists now, other than the kind of most extreme hedge fund making millions out of chaos, is going to back that strategy during a crisis as severe as this one, and actually a crisis which is not going to end even after it's over, right? The financial crisis hadn't ended, the impact of that hadn't ended when this crisis hit. This crisis, the impact of that is going to be even longer term. We'll still be struggling with stagnant productivity, with rising inequality, with low wages, with obviously climate breakdown in 10 years. And the state will still be the only institution that's capable of kind of marshalling our collective resources in order to solve those problems in the interest of capital. Basically, I mean, that is ultimately what I think the reason is for this shift, this broader shift in the nature of state policy. Those people will continue to exist, but I cannot see them gaining enough influence to really like wrench back control over their party. What is interesting though, and you see this already, is that there does seem to be this kind of this kind of shift in the political sands, where those people on the kind of furthest right are like, oh, our government's doing too much. They're kind of the most extreme kind of libertarian economic commentators are feeling increasingly kind of disenfranchised and aloof. And often they then end up saying all of this is happening because our political culture has become all about political correctness, and they end up going not just the far right economically, but actually over to the very far right culturally. And I think that's a kind of big feeding ground for the far right, actually. And then you just get higher levels of support around that agenda, which I mean that is the big challenge that we have to face at the moment. And basically what I'm kind of talking about here when I talk about on the need to discuss the centralization of capitalism, the class nature of the state, the need to democratize, need to hand power back to people, is what could the left's political economic narrative be in response to the right, so that we aren't consistently trying to fight this culture war, which is a losing battle. Because if they get us onto that terrain constantly, which they are successfully doing right now, we're completely and utterly screwed. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I hope we can take the that's how I hope we can make a constructive division out of the many different competing cracks and divides and yeah, things that are marking our discourse today.
I think we'll end it there, but I just want to quickly say, and I think this is what Kier Starmer is doing successfully, is he's not saying very much. Now, on the one hand, he should be saying more when it comes to economic policy, but I agree with you on the more culture war stuff. I think you should say relatively little, and I have a sort of reason why I think that. You know, again, Margaret Thatcher wins in '79. She didn't have this big manifesto saying we're going to do this, and this. The only privatization they were offering, or they were guaranteeing, really, I think, was British Airways and maybe one or two other companies, but it was primarily British Airways. What Thatcher was offering was a feeling. She said the unions are too strong.
Yeah.
You know, the economy isn't working. Inflation's too high. That was basically it. And I do think the left is going to have to formulate, and I think you've done this well, and I think you're in your first book, Stolen, when you basically say we need to look at finance capitalism, the City of London, as the bad guys, just as the unions were before. And I think that's right. I think, you know, a successful left leadership, both within and beyond electoralism, but, you know, obviously we're talking about the concept of state power, you know, that will primarily be electoral. They will have only 3 or 4 housing crisis, you know, underemployment, climate change, and hatred of the City of London. You probably don't need to go beyond that. I guess we're over time. But I mean, in 20 seconds, what do you think about that?
I think you're right about that point about that, the feeling, right? And I think the feeling, however you make this felt, is that point about people needing to feel like they are going to have power over their lives again. I think that is the big challenge we face. And especially during the election, going to various different places, speaking to people, there was just this pervasive sense of just like disempowerment, of just like apathy. And that quickly translates into a kind of loathing of the political elite that has put you in that situation. It's the worst feeling to have in your life. It's just to feel like nothing you can do matters. I think that's what the left needs to be speaking to.
Thomas Powell says war with the banks is a hell of a lot harder than Thatcher's war with the unions. Well, the unions defeated Heath in '74, so we might think that, but actually it was a huge political confrontation. And I think
at least a decade.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to leave it there. One thing people can do is, of course, pre-order Grace's critically important book, Corona Crisis. When is it out, Grace?
On the 27th of October, and obviously also order Aaron's book in paperback, which is incredibly important and which I have loved, and which at all the events we've done over the past however many years, I have thoroughly enjoyed hearing about. There's always something new in there, I think. And I'm also very excited to read your stuff about demographic aging, because this is such an important topic. We were discussing that point about falling fertility rates, I think, the other day, and it's just like one of those big issues that, I mean, I haven't even touched on it here. We haven't really, talked about it, but it's so huge.
This is the thing with modern capitalism. It's got its head in the sand. Not 1 or 2 crises, but like a dozen.
Too many.
Yeah. Thank you, Grace. Thank you for everybody who's tuned in. Verso have been kind enough to host this. I guess there'll be more events coming. Check out their Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook for more. Grace and I will see you soon, I'm sure. We'll see you, I guess, next time. Good night.
Bye.